The ethics of information. The context of information society raises the question of the ethics of information. What does it mean in the context of critical thinking and media literacy? When we turn to the tools of critical thinking, we essentially look for cognitive resources. The classical themes of critical thinking are separable from ethical issues, but there is an ethical habitus implicit in the quest for truth. Having acquired true knowledge, the question is, how do we use it? If we approach it from the concept of media literacy, one can easily contextualize questions such as, why is the content of information published? What is the impact on the recipient? What means are acceptable when obtaining, interpreting, and publishing information? Information ethics is part of a variety of disciplines, including computer ethics, business ethics, medical ethics, computer science, information philosophy, social epistemology, and library science. It is defined as the branch of ethics that focuses on the relationship between the creation, organization, dissemination, and use of information, and the ethical standards and moral codes governing human conduct in society. The circulation of information presupposes the application of ethical and moral principles, whether explicit or implicit. In terms of content, the questions that arise are those that also have a moral dimension. With regard to the privacy aspect of information, the question arises, what options do we have to protect our data? What abuses are possible if our personal data fall into unauthorized hands? And on the moral principles of action, we can ask, for example, the question of the accountability of artificial intelligence. On the environmental side, we can ask how to behave in the information sphere. The life cycle of information, which includes the stages of creation, collection, recording, dissemination, and processing, raises questions of ownership, anonymity, and storage. Considering these problems, it is reasonable to say that in the information society, it is vital to know how to disseminate information correctly and be responsible for how information is handled. Severson identifies 4 basic principles of information ethics: respect for intellectual property, respect for privacy, fair representation, and non-maleficence. Let's take a closer look at respect for privacy and what questions may be asked about the ethical use of information. The expansion of digitalization into almost all areas of life raises a number of questions. Questions about our personal lives can appear anywhere from profiles created on social media to data captured and collected by the health system, from questions typed into a search engine to information uploaded to the cloud. The question may arise, how much of this remains our own property? Who guarantees its preservation? What abuses are possible, and what considerations do we need to take when using it? The underlying assumption is that privacy is a fundamental value, as it allows us to live our own lives. The need to define the borders that delimit what belongs to the individual is fundamental. Now, the complexity of the notion of privacy can be simplified by distinguishing between an external and an internal dimension. Our personal lives include issues that relate to our inner values, principles, and freedom of conscience. It also includes all those questions that involve the inner events of our lives, where the unwary interest of another person would be an obstacle. Whether it's a question of our love life, our religious beliefs, or questions of conscience. All of these reflect data that can be used to infer individual behavior and motivation, and are mostly not part of the general public. The external dimension of our lives is captured in the form of property. This includes all those identifiers that make us externally identifiable: name, photo, address, phone number, social media profile, bank account, or even DNA information. It is clear that these dimensions of privacy are set in stone as information. In this sense, it is closely related to the concepts of secrecy, confidentiality, anonymity, and data protection as part of informational privacy. It can refer to any personal data that is part of our identity. In this context, the confidentiality of information plays a fundamental role, clearly limiting access. If this information becomes public, it could lead to discrimination, shame, or stigmatization of the person concerned. Data protection and security are of particular concern for electronic data, which are easily portable, making it almost impossible to assess the damage caused by a possible system breach. At the same time, information systems should strive for anonymity, and individuals should not be identifiable. Accountability, as well as compliance with professional standards, is another condition that privacy requires. According to Alan F. Westin, privacy is the right of individuals, groups, or institutions to decide when, how, and to what extent information about them can be shared with others. This definition emphasizes the role of control and thus seeks to establish a communication during which information is transmitted in a particular direction. The perfect privacy, according to Gavison, would be if no one had information about X, no one was interested in X, and no one had any physical contact with X. This abstraction highlights an essential question of the debate. Is the enhancement of privacy the dissolution of community life? Is it really only a particular person who is affected by certain information, or can it also be of public interest? A set of ethical values lies behind the notion of privacy, and some argue that this set may underpin the definition of man as a moral being. Physical, informational, and decision-making privacy is fundamental to respect for human dignity, moral autonomy, and a functioning community. The circles of our social relations are distinguished precisely by their distance or proximity to our private lives. Therefore, private life is not considered a total isolation, but rather a form of relationship with those close to us based on trust. To return to the definition of privacy, let us quote the English jurist and philosopher James Fitzjames Stevens, who in his book Liberty, Equality and Fraternity put it this way: conduct that can be described as indecent is always in some way a violation of privacy. The question can, of course, be about the intent and extent of the indecency and the perpetrator. If we are talking about fully comprehensive information systems, it is easy to see that vast amounts of data can fall into the wrong hands and be used to initiate virtually anything. If the public authorities have access to the data and handle it inappropriately, then we talk about an Orwellian system at an ethical and political level. There is no need to dwell on the picture presented in 1984, a world that perfectly illustrates the consequences of the eradication of privacy. The desire for the power of omniscience leads to the possession of instruments that provide absolute transparency. It is an ethical question to find balance between information databases and restriction, self-discipline and rationality.